We can't tell our people they can vote yes on abolishing slavery unless at the same time we can tell them that you're seeking a negotiated peace.
It's either the amendment or this Confederate peace. You cannot have both.
How many hundreds of thousands have died during your administration?
Congress must never declare equal those whom God created unequal.
Leave the Constitution alone.
We're stepped out upon the world stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilled to afford us this moment. Now!
Lincoln was one of Hollywood's biggest exports in 2012, a story of the 16th U.S. president trying to persuade Congress to outlaw slavery. Critics say that the film glosses over Abraham Lincoln's many faults and puts him on a pedestal. Accusations of distorting history are not new to Hollywood. As they say in the media industry, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. To discuss that and more, I'm joined now from London by Toby Miller, Professor of Cultural Industries at City University. He's written and edited over 30 books and studies the impact of Hollywood worldwide. Also with us from Hong Kong, Asian-American actor and producer Ting, who wrote, produced and acted in the recent independent feature film Supercapitalist. Welcome to both of you to the show. Toby, let me start with you and a quote from The Economist, which said in a recent piece on the movie industry, and it was referring particularly to the Oscars, and I'm paraphrasing here, it said that the true worth of a movie is no longer decided at the Oscars or indeed in the United States. It's decided by youngsters in countries like Russia, Brazil, and more in China. How did this shift take place?
Well, it's a very interesting question with a slightly complicated answer, but I'll be brief. For a long time, Hollywood has actually looked outside its own shores for a major part of its audience. In fact, for most of the last 50 years, more than half its box office revenue has come from beyond North America. But especially now that's important because, as we know, there is a burgeoning middle class with money to spend and a taste, it seems, for Hollywood-style movies around the world. At the same time, DVD sales in particular, which have been extremely lucrative for Hollywood domestically in the last 10 years, are really dropping off. So there's a new middle class audience, there are new places in which to sell films, and the domestic market, although reasonably strong in terms of box office, i.e. going to movie theatres, is dropping off in terms of DVDs, which has been a major source of revenue.
Interesting what you say there about DVDs, Toby. In fact, I guess we could attribute that to the fact that there's better streaming technology right now. But let's go to Derek in Hong Kong. Derek, the movie market in China is potentially one of the biggest in the world. In fact, Ernst & Young says that by 2020, China will be the biggest market for American movies. But there are still some pretty tight restrictions there on how many movies can be brought into China, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a quota for the China system, but I think that's, a part of their overall system. They're really trying to monitor growth. Right now, I think the number is 34. So as we see China's film industry expand, we'll see that number go up.
Yeah, as Derek suggests, I think that number will increase. There was almost a total prohibition on the importation of Hollywood film and television until China joined the World Trade Organization, and part of the deal for accession to the WTO was the opening up of those markets. And of course what we see in the United States is a voracious appetite for the mythic Chinese consumer, whether real or imagined, an almost unseemly haste to sell to China, in return, in a sense, for the constant buy from China that people in the United States do. So the United States is buying the very technologies that it's making movies on from China and hoping that it can sell the movies that are made with that technology back to China.
America is a very aggressive exporter of its pop culture, especially movies and television shows in particular. In fact, for many young people outside of the United States, America is defined by these things. That's how they see America. But yet, the United States is so impervious to other cultures coming into this country.
I think, yeah, Hollywood movies are very influential. In fact, just all media is influential. How we look, how we dress, how we think, how we have a perspective on ourselves. I think that's, it's really the media and sort of that continual bombardment of it is really an influence of how you see yourself, your identity. That being said, I think, it's a competitive market, and Hollywood's doing a great job. I mean, they spend a lot of money. Their budgets are 100 times sometimes people's films. say for my example, the example of my film, it was made for under $1 million US. And when you put a film in the US with 1 million going versus 100 million, you're going to see a difference.
Toby, let me get your take on this.
There's a real imbalance in export and import trade of film and television drama in particular between the United States and the rest of the world. No question about that. And it's been a problem for a very, very long time. This is extremely odd when you have a nation, as JFK said, of immigrants, when you have hundreds of different languages being spoken, when you have, in the case of Los Angeles, supposedly the second biggest Spanish-speaking city in the world. It is claimed, it is alleged by distributors, exhibitors, producers in the US that Americans, meaning US people, don't like subtitles, don't like foreign movies, only want their own culture. That's patently absurd. Univision is frequently the top-rating television network in the United States. It is all in Spanish. There are thriving Vietnamese and Chinese language television services, for example, in the United States. The South Asian community devours Bollywood product and so on. But in terms of the stranglehold that a small number of companies has over distribution in particular, this distorts the capacity of the system to import the right number of programs from the right number of countries. So it all looks very skewed, and the alibi for this is the supposedly nationalistic tastes of US audiences. I don't think that's the real answer. I think the real answer is the stranglehold of the small number of distributors who control what gets put onto American screens.
Derek, do you also find that it's difficult for foreign actors and producers to work in the United States?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think there is, definitely a lack of diversity. I think, the easy answer would be to say, oh, well, they're just trying to keep us out. But I really think actually what we need to do is look at the long term and develop talent, innovate, and compete on the level that they're competing on. So really about bringing people to the next level, like high-level producers who can raise money and make the same quality Hollywood films. I think that's personally the way to get there. I also think, I mean, yeah, we have there's definitely an appetite, but the appetite doesn't seem to be substantial enough to sustain, let's say, a wide release. But things are changing. Fortunately, we got a really good release. It's called a day-and-date release, which is video on demand and theaters. And this type of technology is changing the landscape, and it's opening up new players. Just much like Facebook has changed marketing, I think VOD is changing the way we release a movie.
That's right, Toby. We mentioned earlier the influence that high-tech streaming is now having on the sales of DVD, etc. I mean, what are the other influences that modern technology is having on the movie industry?
Well, one of the important ones is that because of the ability now to stream movies, to rent them, companies like Netflix and so on, companies like Hulu, the movie producers, particularly the big studios, want to cut out the middle person. They want to have direct relationships between the movies that they've either made or at least own and consumers or audiences. So that seems to be a way of, in a sense, having that direct connection and making a lot of money. On the other hand, of course, one of the influences, one of the possibilities of this new technology is what's sometimes called piracy. In other words, people illegally downloading or streaming material without going through the usual intellectual property routines. We all know about the capacity of peer-to-peer file sharing and the way that that's changed the record industry, for example. So there are both constraints and opportunities. These are things that Hollywood's had to deal with in an interesting dynamic ever since really the beginning of sound and color and all the other technological innovations.
I want to ask you, both of you, and I want to go to Derek first, about the biggest movie industry in the world, and that's in India. And it turns some of the conventional thinking about movies on its head, because here we have in India a huge industry, and an industry where the Americans have not made a breakthrough. They have not been able to get in there. Why is that, Derek?
Actually, Bollywood has great movies. I mean, they take pride in their own movies, and people come out and support it. They also have a large population, so then there's definitely a financial incentive as well. So and that being said, if they're producing enough movies to capture the theatricals, then it's really hard for the Hollywood movies to get in.
Toby, I mean, if you look at, say, for instance, the Chinese movie market, here we have the Americans making big inroads there. China's going to be the biggest market in 2020, as we've heard. That does not translate at all in India.
I think it's important to realize that India isn't only Bollywood. Of course, there are several very important film industries. It's the most famous one and the one that we tend to see the most movies from in the rest of the world, point one. Point two, there have actually been many false dawns, occasions when Hollywood has done quite well in India, often disrupted by either a failure to follow up or all kinds of state intervention at the Indian end that slowed things down, or incompetence on Hollywood's part. Right now, actually what we're seeing is a strategy that Hollywood is using in both India and China, which is in order to try to understand the local market better, to get involved in co-productions. So rather than just selling US product, actually going to India and working with local producers. The other thing that I think is very relevant, and this applies to a certain extent to both China and India, is that the Hollywood influence isn't just about selling the movies that are made for the United States and in the United States. It's also about trying to get control of distribution. And what Hollywood is very interested in doing is taking the reins of how movies circulate in India. It's doing quite well at that. And finally, there is a controversy in India right now that's been going on really in a rising wave for the last decade of whether or not locally produced movies are changing under Hollywood's influence, by which I mean more sex and more violence.
Okay, and I want to have a look at one other influence that it seems the consumers of movies are now having on the producers of movies. And Derek, you may want to address this. You know, have you found that in China, to some extent, the Chinese audiences or the people who import the movies want to influence the creative process? For instance, I'm looking here at one of the movies that was recently made, Men in Black 3, had to edit out a scene because the Chinese were depicted as bad guys, as the villains in this movie. The making of Red Dawn had to change the villains from Chinese to North Korean.
It's, again, I was saying it's the overarching system. I mean, I think they're dealing with 1.4 billion people, and they're managing an economy that's growing at a rapid pace. And so really they're just concerned about sort of influencing the people. And as we said earlier, actually, that media influences identity. If you encourage that too fast, you know, it can create instability in the economy and you know, the government. So I think really that's where they're coming from. That being said, obviously, as a filmmaker, I'm not going to love it because that's not the you know, we're changing the artwork. So you know, I totally understand the point of view, but then you know, obviously we want our stories told the way we want to tell them. But I think, you know, as China really adapts and grows, it's going to have that, you know, it's going to get to that stage. And what we need to do is foster that, be really supportive.
Right. Toby, there also seems to be an influence on the types of movies that Hollywood wants to make right now because they're very aware of where these movies are being seen. I mean, I found an interesting fact here that Paramount, the big studio, is now not inclined to make comedies because the US sense of humor, say, involving actors like Will Ferrell, they don't translate very well in foreign countries like Russia or China.
I think a Hollywood dictum going back a very long way is that movies are about action. And whilst there's a long tradition of screwball comedies and nowadays romantic comedies in Hollywood, there's also been a long action-adventure tradition. Why? Well, partly because it makes for good vision. You know, things happen, people move, planes explode, fires occur, and so on. And partly because it means that you don't have to worry too much about linguistic and cultural differences. Jokes that are very verbal may not translate well. Characters that involve complex development through dialogue and through exchanges of that kind with other people don't have to be such a difficulty when what you're showing is car chases and bombs and aircraft carriers. So the action-adventure story is a very successful way, historically, both in and outside the United States, of appealing to linguistically and culturally diverse audiences. Also, it's expensive to make, which means it's difficult to compete with. Hollywood has lots of money in those studios, and they manage to put it up on the screen. Take a movie like Skyfall, partly British, partly US film, the latest James Bond movie. Vast amount of money that you can see as a moviegoer on the screen. Very hard to match in terms of action-adventure portrayals made anywhere else.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Anand. Nice to meet both of you.